Oh man, we're getting so close to an incredible celebration next week. I've seen a couple of rundowns of what's going to happen, and man, it's going to be amazing. I'd love to tell you what we're celebrating, but I can't. It'll actually have to be next week. That'll have to mention all that. So until then, mum's the word. I'm not going to say a word about that. But here's the question we've been going at, and what I want to use to kind of prepare our hearts for next Sunday. And the question that we've been kind of going at is this: what does faith look like when life falls apart? And if you call yourself believer, if you call yourself Christian, you kind of have to own that one. You got to kind of mine down to get a rock solid sort of answer to this, because not only will this happen in your life where faith, something will happen and life will fall apart, but people are also wanting to know the answer to this question in your life. People you do life with, people who are struggling, people who are thinking about believing, or maybe people who used to believe and now they don't. Well, part of the reason is because they never answered this question. What does faith look like when life falls apart? And so we've been studying Psalm 139, and David wrote Psalm 139 and all these incredible foundational truths, and he's apparently in the middle of this crisis, and he's losing. So in other words, his life, as he would know it, is actually falling apart, and he's feeling defeated by it. And this is kind of where David lands as we read through his emotional progression in Psalm 139. He intentionally makes decisions based on what he knows to be true about God. Key word, what he knows to be true about God, even though it may not feel good or even right in the moment. Don't miss this, because this is like basic Christianity 101. If this whole thing is somebody's trying to sell you some bill of goods that it will all feel right all the time, don't buy that, because it's not true. The question is whether or not it works when life falls apart. That's what you got to figure out. Now, this is a great answer, I think, because I've seen this to be true in my life, the lives of people I love, the lives of people I do life with. I've seen this true, where you do what you know is right, even when it doesn't feel good. And many of us have sort of carried that out. And it sort of helps me because I'm more comfortable in the logical, mental world than I am the emotional world. Is that okay for me to say? And so I find more peace up in the mental thing than I do the logic or the feeling thing. So I'm into systems and systematic theology. And even though I know you can never shove God in a box, I do my best to try to do that. And so it's even though I know I can't, but I still have these feelings. And emotions are a big part of who we are, of who I am. In fact, they're the color parts of life for me. They put color in life. And while emotions aren't always the best thing for me to make a decision based on, they're still important. And so I have this little system in my life that I use to kind of monitor how I'm doing. And I won't kind of bore you with what that system is, but I'll just tell you this, that in my life, I enjoy giving. I enjoy giving of myself. I enjoy giving of what I know. I enjoy giving in leadership circles, in church circles, Bible teaching circles, whatever. And I love those kinds of things. But what I had learned early on in ministry is I can give to such a point where I damage myself and the people I love. Everybody okay so far? You can do the same thing. You can fry yourself out giving so much of yourself and your time that your family or yourself, you pay the cost for that. And so what I had to do is I had to develop this tool that would allow me to kind of monitor the major systems of Tom, the corporation of Tom, such as it is, so that I would know how I'm doing. And so I did. I kind of developed this quick dashboard report on how my systems are doing. And the systems I monitor are three. So I monitor the physical, the mental, and the spiritual parts of who I am. And I rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. And I have goals set in all three areas: physical, mental, and spiritual. And so at any time, if someone on staff or Lise or one of the kids asks, "Hey, Dad, how are things going?" or "How are you doing?" I can do a quick review. Well, physical, I'm not sleeping well, or I'm not eating right, or I'm not exercising, whatever that might be. Mental, well, what am I putting in my mind on a consistent basis? What messages on repeat? And then the spiritual side of things, how are things going? Now, one of the pieces so if I can keep these three pieces healthy, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, what I discovered is if those will be healthy, they all feed the emotional one. You see what I'm saying? So that's kind of how I know how I'm doing emotionally. If those three are healthy, then my emotional world tends to be pretty good. If the physical, mental, or spiritual worlds aren't doing that great, well, I'm most likely bottoming out emotionally as well. All that to say this. One of the things I monitor in my spiritual world might be a surprise to you. But here's what it is. In my spiritual world, I constantly ask myself the question, when was the last time I was moved in a worship service or in private devotion? Now, let me see if I can get you on this side of the platform just for a minute. I know you're surprised at this, so am I, but I do this for a living. I don't know how I got the job either. I really don't. So what that means is, it's great, it's worship, but it's also work. You with me? And so I'm working today while y'all doing nothing. So I'm working, and that's great. I love working. This is fantastic. Work's a good thing. So after today finishes, what will happen is Monday comes. That's not the amazing part. You already knew that. But Monday comes, and guess what I got to do? I got to start prepping for what's going to come next. So it's constant, whether it's a prep for discovery, or prep for another class, or prepping for a leadership staff thing, or prepping for a message. And so it's constant. And what I discovered was I could get to such a point in my ministry where I was doing the pace of ministry. I was living the pace of ministry at such a point that it was destroying the intimate relationship with Jesus I had. Are you following what I'm saying? So that's where this came from. I discovered I got to monitor that. I do this for a living, and when I really start to feel it is around Easter time. Because Easter, even though I can't tell you what happens, I know what happens. I've read the whole book. I know what happens. I've preached about what happens for 30 years, I'll bet. I've preached that. And so the question that I want to wrestle with on a personal level is this. Is it possible for me to feel what I know to be true about God? Is it possible for me to feel what we know to be true about God? And that's an unusual question for me to ask in this context. But I think it's an important question. Because we can know things. But God help us if we ever stop feeling the things we know. So let me share with you a thought that's helping me feel the power of Easter this year. Psalm 139, David is in some kind of battle as we've been studying. He knows much about who God is. He knows that God is everywhere. He knows God knows everything. And he knows that God cares. Those are all things he knows. But the feelings he's expressing in this psalm aren't feelings of worship. They're actually feelings of vengeance. Do you remember? You read through the psalm and he's like, search me, O God, know my heart. And then he says, but kill that guy. I hate that guy, wipe them out, whatever. And those are the emotions that he is feeling in the psalm. He's in this battle of sorts, and it's a battle that I know well. And respectfully, I'll bet it's a battle you know well, and it's this. He knows what's right, but he wants to do something else. He knows what's right, but he feels like doing something else. I know you care for everything, and I know you know everything, and I know you're everywhere, but I'd really like to take my neighbor out, is essentially what David is saying. If you have those feelings, you should maybe get some help along the way, but I mean, that's what David is feeling in that moment, and that's important. David fights this battle throughout this entire psalm, but his strategy for having victory in this battle, I know what's right, but I don't feel like doing it, is this strange strategy for victory, and as soon as I say it, you're going to reject it. Because his strategy for victory, I know what's right, but I don't feel like doing it, is this. He surrenders. He surrenders. To surrender means he stops resisting and he submits to an authority. The way I could say it here in our context is this. Surrender means to give up and give in. Now I've lost the entire room. Tom, give up and give in? Have you seen my Facebook wall? I don't give up and give in to anything, right? I mean, I've got pretty strong opinions and they're all right. You know, so that's kind of who I am. See, and I would think that I'm agreeing with you, which actually is I'm agreeing with myself because I was pretending to be you. But nonetheless, I'm agreeing in this moment because I think in our culture right now, everybody should fight for a cause because that's what we value. And if you don't fight for the same cause we do, then you and I are going to fight because we value the fight. We like the idea of changing what we don't like. We like resisting the other side. It's us and them and us against the world. And in this age of let's all fight for something, David says, let's surrender. Let's give up and give in. Here's what I struggle with about this concept of surrender. I love old war movies. I love them. I'll watch them all. I'd watch them over and over again, even though I know who wins. But if you ever watch an old war movie or maybe seen some of the old documentaries or whatever, have you noticed that the surrender day, one side celebrating, but the other side isn't? And that's my problem with surrender. And you should think about this before you consider doing it. Because surrendering means someone gave up and someone gave in, and that can be humiliating. And I see this happen all the time in my life, and I see it in lives of people I talk to and love. Sometimes surrender produces this victim mentality that's part of our culture. I tried to work on it, but it didn't work. Woe is me. I tried to resist, but I just couldn't. Well, the problem is I'm an addict, so I'll never get over this, or I'm a failure, so I can't, or I fell out of love, or I'm a loser, or this is just the way I am. And I told you that phrase, it is what it is. But oftentimes, those are cries of people who surrendered. You may be an ambassador to England or France. Anybody know yet where I'm going? Raise your hand if you know. Okay. You may like to gamble. You may like to dance. Okay, I got one. I got two. I see all the old men. Okay, and you both are, so don't say anything. I know. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord. Two Bob Dylan fans. But you're going to have to serve somebody. The great theologian Bob Dylan penned those words, and they still ring as true. Everybody's going to serve somebody, and somebody's saying, who's Bob Dylan? And you need a new pastor. I'd quote Justin Bieber, but he's never written that much profound. So, I just kind of stuck. Don't blame me. He's your idol. Well, in Psalm 139, David accepts that avoiding surrender is impossible. David comes to the reality that I think everybody has to wrestle with. And you may not believe this to be true for you right now, but I wish you'd at least file it away. I think everybody serves somebody. Everybody is serving something. But instead of David being victimized by those words, I gave up and give in, David actually chooses who he's going to surrender to. He chooses where he's going to put all the eggs in what basket, to just use an Easter thing. He chooses that. And so this is what he says to finish it in a word of command. This is what he finishes his psalm with. God, you search me. God, you know me. Test me. See if this is really taking. Know my thoughts. And then he says, you see if there's any wicked way in here, and then lead me. Does that sound like surrender? You lead me in the way everlasting. See, in the kingdom of God and in our world and in our culture and in our private lives, we're all surrendering to something. The difference is some of us have chosen it and some of us have defaulted to it. And you know what brings a person to surrender? Do you know what brings a world force or a world army to a point of surrender? When they are overwhelmed by someone's power. Whenever you are overwhelmed by someone else's or another army's or another world's power, that's when the surrender actually takes place. So Psalm 139 is David's reflection on all powerful, all-knowing, all-caring person of God, and he surrenders. Because he's overwhelmed with someone else's power. Could we? There we are, yeah. Have you ever done that? Ever been that way? Overwhelmed by someone else's power. Next week is Easter. And in the Easter season, we reflect on the overwhelming power of Jesus' surrender on the cross. God died. Messiah died. And yet surrender leads to victory, and Easter celebrates that. But that's next week. Without a cross, without suffering, without dying, without surrender, there would be no victory in Jesus. And if there's no victory for Jesus, then there's no victory for me. So the Bible teaches that this cross, this act of surrender, is actually a gift for us. Even Jesus himself said it's the most powerful act of love when one person lays down their life for another person. Now, with that all there, I need to take you down a bit of theology for us to feel what we know, and then hopefully end up at a feeling place. In the beginning, God creates humanity. Humanity and God lived in perfect harmony. Humanity and God. But humans chose something other than perfect harmony with God. Adam and Eve, they made the decision that everybody in this room has decided before, and it's this. They wanted to know what evil was. Whether it was a relationship, whether it was some kind of decision, whether it was self-aggrandizement, whether it was selfishness, whatever. They wanted to know what evil was, just like everybody in the room. And the result of this pursuit for them was sin, just like it is in our lives. So today, sin is inseparable almost from our existence. And if you spent any time with a 2-year-old outside of your grandchildren, you have seen this in even a 2-year-old. Sin is defined in a whole lot of ways in Scripture. It's lawlessness and disobedience and rebellion and transgressions. But one of the most common terms that we've used for sin, most common definitions of sin, is taken from the world of archery. And that definition is idea of missing a mark. So it's literally pulling an arrow back and then aiming up on a target, letting it go, and totally missing that target. So what is the target if that is what sin is? Well, that offers this beautiful word picture of lining the tip of the arrow. The bullseye in this case is the state that we were all created to live. What is that state? Ready for this? God-like perfection. Living in harmony with God, living in perfection with God, perfect righteousness, perfect justice. Well, much like Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden, that's what the target was, and we've never done this before because we're missing the mark. Sin is now a state of being, if you will. It's a fallen nature where we miss the mark of God-like perfection, and everybody in the room knows this is to be true in our lives. And the effect of this after the Garden of Eden is this. Adam and Eve make a decision away from God-like perfection so they won't hit that mark. And the effect is this. Adam and Eve now have a different relationship with God. So much so, you ready? They can no longer be in the presence of God. They have to hide. They have to cover themselves. You remember God walked into the garden. He says, hey, where are y'all at? You know, we used to hang out and walk in the garden in the cool of the day and sit on the front porch and drink lemonade and swing and talk about stuff, catch lightning bugs or whatever you do with God when you're hanging out. But that's not going to happen anymore. Why? Well, it's because of this. Imperfect me cannot coexist with perfect righteousness. And God's perfect. And what this means is we're pretty much hopelessly abandoned in our perfection, separated from God as humanity. Separated from the source of joy and hope and peace and purpose. And you know what the Scripture refers to us in that state as? forsaken. We now have forsaken status. And this creates a problem for God. The divine dilemma is this: how will God solve the problem of our forsaken status while remaining righteous or true to himself? How can God fix my missing the mark and still remain faithful to who he is without changing his character? So there's a couple options. Well, God could say, you know what? Everything is fine. Everybody back in the pool. Let's have a good time. You chose something else, but you can still be with me. It's okay. But in order for that to happen, God's character would have to change. He'd have to give up his God credentials because he's perfect in righteousness. And perfect cannot mesh with imperfect. Option 2 was this: God could say, you chose something other than me, sucks to be you. See ya. But in order for that to happen, God, who has perfect righteousness, also has perfect love. And so again, he'd have to compromise who he is. So how in the world is God going to solve this problem without compromising his own character? Well, that's the power of the cross. Because God knew the only solution for the divine dilemma would be to pay off our infinite debt as humanity with an infinite payment. So he chose, God did, to surrender a piece of his righteous self, his son, Jesus Christ. So Jesus, the Son of God, then willingly surrenders his relationship with the Father to join humanity. He endures the cross and all of its suffering and shame so that our infinite debt might be paid off. Make no mistake, Jesus, who wasn't guilty, who wasn't imperfect, knew the moment he stepped out of heaven, read Philippians 2 if you ever want to kind of take a trip down scripture lane on this, knew the moment he left heaven that he was choosing to become our sin. So Jesus willingly surrendered himself in order to shoulder all our sin, guilt, shame, and moral debt. Now, I don't know what y'all been up to, but the load that I presented was significant to begin with. But he didn't just choose to shoulder mine. He chose to shoulder yours. And he didn't just choose to shoulder yours. He chose to shoulder all of history and all of future for all of humanity, that sin debt. And he put our moral debt on his account. He put it on his back. It was nailed to a cross, and they killed it. But in this moment, God solved the great dilemma. God is able to stay true to his righteousness, righteous love, righteous justice, righteous perfection. He's able to stay true to all of that by placing the infinite debt of humanity on his infinite shoulders, and the Son of God surrendered through death. And in that moment, our forsaken status changed. But here's what I want you to know. Not only did our forsaken status change, but also the Son of God's forsaken status changed. Because this is what Jesus said in this moment the divine dilemma was solved. He said on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, this was a big deal. Because for the first time in all of what is eternity, and I have no idea how to describe this to you, the Son of God, for the first time, felt abandoned by God Himself, His Father. For the first time, He felt forsaken. I don't think He felt it in any of His 33 years before this moment on the cross. Why now? And this, my dear friend, is where the transaction took place, where Jesus willingly surrendered and He chose to take on Tom's, our forsaken status. What's that mean? Jesus and my sin cannot be in the same space as God's righteous love and justice. So for the first time in all of eternity, the Son of God cannot be with the Father. And as Jesus hangs on the cross and nears death, He faces the same question we face on the daily. Will God stay true to His promise? It's faith. The belief that God is who He says He is, and He will do everything that He promises to do. And then right before He exhales His last breath, Jesus says this in Luke. He calls out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And when He said this, He breathed His last. Don't miss this. The dying breath of the man many of us claim to follow. The dying breath of Jesus, the last exhale from His lungs, was actually a cry to surrender. I'm totally out of control. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Do you understand the emotional wear and tear of what Jesus just went through on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me, abandoned me, left me out to dry? Why am I dying by myself? And yet, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. Can you feel that? Even though in this moment, God, you have turned your back on me, I put myself in your hands. So, how does David tie into all this? You know those two things that Jesus said on the cross? Those weren't just Jesus' words. You should know those were actually written about 1,000 years before Jesus ever walked the earth. And they were written by a poet, a king, a shepherd boy, an adulterer, a liar, and a murderer, and a man after God's own heart. These words written by David. And as a Jewish boy, of course, Jesus knew David's words well. The Psalms were a regular part of his worship. He worshiped his father with these words growing up for all of his life. And so in Psalm 22, David writes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" 1,000 years before Jesus ever hung on a cross. If you've never read Psalm 22 and you have doubts about faith, read Psalm 22 and then explain what happened There's something that's mysterious there that someone needs to figure out. Either it's faith or it's Twilight Zone or something freaky. Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Just to let you know, Psalm 22 also prophesies the piercing of the side and the soldiers gambling for Jesus' garment, things that Jesus couldn't even control, predicted in Psalm 22, 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth. Oh, and the other one, Psalm 31, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now let me tell you why I'm getting the feels this time of year. Don't miss the beauty of what you just saw. Because this is moving me this season, and I'm praying it will move you. 1,000 years before Jesus would be forsaken on the cross, because imperfect cannot mesh with perfect righteousness. Sin cannot mesh with perfect righteousness. Conditional love cannot mesh with perfect love. God the Father goes to one of his servant people like us, and he says to David, write down these words. God the Father gave the words to David that his son would need to lean on at a time when God the Father could not be there for his son. Do you see it? God the Father knew he would have to forsake his own son. And so 1,000 years before the moment happens, God prompts the heart of David, my God, why have you forsaken me? Into your hands I commit my spirit. And when his son is on the cross and his son feels alone and his son has been abandoned because imperfect cannot mesh with perfect, and his son shouldered the sins of the world, God gave his son the words he would want to say. Isn't that beautiful? Oh boy, I know I can't get to you right now. But think, we've been worshiping together. Think about it. Jesus starts to recall the Psalms of David. Maybe he looks around and says, oh, they're gambling for my coat. That's what David said in Psalm 22. Do you think that might be what happened? God gave his son words to strengthen him when he could not be there, and that, friends, overwhelms me, and I'll tell you why. I want to be loved like that. I wish I could say it in a more manly way. But man, I want that kind of love, and not just that. I want to give that kind of love. And when Jesus exhaled, into your hands I commit my spirit, he died. And when he died, so did the power of sin. It will be completed, but I can't tell you about that this week. You're not going to believe how this story ends and begins. On the cross, our forsakenness is completely paid for, and a personal relationship with God and intimacy with God is now available, which simply leaves just one more question. Ready? Are you willing to surrender to that kind of love? Don't shove this off. Don't push this off. Make sure you have settled this one. Make a call. Have some courage. One way or the other. Make a commitment. One way or the other. Are we willing to surrender that kind of love? Now, some of us think, Tom, I've been a believer forever. Of course I surrendered. Have you? Have you? Are we living that kind of love? Really? Not like where we love people that look like us, smell like us, and act like us, and vote like us. I'm talking about a love that actually is surrendered and reaches people that we don't even like. that are obnoxious, that grate us, that try to hurt or harm. You know what else this has kind of done to me in the feels department is I wonder what God is doing to care for you and for me in our moment of crisis long ago that will actually come to fruition in that moment for us. Did you all follow it all what I just said? Because I'm not sure. I think I got lost when I was really talking about that. So is it possible that when I was running from God and I stumbled into some revival service at 17 and 18 years old, and I started hearing what God was saying, and I was listening to a pastor who went to school with some of my closest friends and lived like a hellion all through school, but God got a hold of him. And then later on at 20, I'm sitting in that same service, and that same dude comes to a pulpit, and I answer a call to ministry because God had put it in play from the very beginning. And I just wonder what God has prepared for you and for me in the moment of crisis that you might be going through now, where you had that doctor find their faith, we had that lawyer find some faith, we had that person say the right thing, that letter come, that email come, because the sovereign God was orchestrating the whole thing from the very beginning because of the Father's love. He loves you. That trips my trigger and cracks my voice. Ah, mercy. If you desire the infinite payment Jesus made on the cross, all you do is believe that God is that good. And God loves you that much. If you desire that intimacy with God, it is now your freedom to choose. You are free to give up and give in, or you are free to resist. God will not force it on you, but you can surrender to that kind of love and spend the rest of your life surrendered to that kind of love. And one day when we stand before God, now I know that causes emotions in the room because I was raised in a context that was a fear-produced point. I don't believe that anymore. So I think when I stand before God, I believe this to be true, that Jesus now intercedes to the Father on my behalf. And I stand with Jesus. I don't know how this works out, but just let Tom's brain go. So I'm standing before God, and I'm standing there with Jesus, and Jesus sees, God sees me and Jesus, his son, stand there, and Jesus says, oh, that's Tom. He's with me. Come on. He's with me. And God looks at it. I don't know if he keeps a book or a computer or what. I don't know. He's like, you're right. He doesn't owe me a doggone thing because God says doggone, I'm pretty sure. He doesn't owe me anything. His account was settled long ago. Come on in. Let's do life and eternity together. Very simple question for you. Will you take God at his word or not? Period. Question mark, period. What do you mean, Tom? Well, it says, for God so loved. It doesn't say he hated the world. So if you got somewhere in your church experience, your believer experience, that God hates everything that's not him, that's not his word. That was someone else's word. It says God so loved the world, not church people, but the whole world. How much did he love them? He was willing to forsake his own son. And whoever just believes in him, you don't perish. But Jesus says that person, she's with me. He's with me. That's in the Bible. That's his word. The next one is just as important. The next verse, God didn't send his son in the world to condemn you. Anytime you hear the voice of God saying you're a screw up, that's not the voice of God. How do you know that? Well, I'm taking him at his word. His word says he didn't come here to rip me a new one. That's what the word says. He didn't come to condemn me, to shake his finger in my face and say, you're such a screw-up, Harding. But he actually came here to save me. Hebrews says it this way. Why don't we fix our eyes on Jesus? Fix our eyes. Surrender to this, the author and perfecter of our faith. Get this one. Who, for the duty, the obligation, the joy set before him, embraced forsakenness, scorned its shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Will you take God at his word? This is one of my favorite ones here. And this is really going to rock some of your world. Will you take God at his word? This is what King David said. He said, God brought me out into a spacious place, and he rescued me. Why would he rescue you, Tom? You stop reading ahead. I'm trying to pause for a dramatic moment. You ready? Because he thinks you're the bomb diggity. It's only in the Hebrew. God delights in you. You should take him at his word. Now we're going to bow our head. Now, I'm not doing anything weird up here. I'm bowing my head too. They're probably going to do a set change to get ready for music. But bow your head and let's settle this question right now. Are you going to take God at his word? One way or the other, let's just decide. So, Lord, we come to this very sacred moment where every individual is bowing at their own personal altar. Some, Lord, are saying, no, I'm not ready. And if that's you, I'm glad you're here. God's glad you're here. He doesn't hate you. He loves you. He loves you. He's not waiting for you to get all cleaned up so he can love you. He's glad you're here too. Some of you are bowing at that personal altar, and maybe for the first time, the lights come on. And you're like, wow, I don't have to be perfect. Someone loved me that much before I ever got here, and that's overwhelming you right now. And if that's you, I just want to say all you have to do is believe. Believe that he loves you that much. And you can do that right where you are. And what that looks like is you surrender. What does that look like, Tom? There's no cookie cutter, dude. I mean, this is you and God. This is a personal relationship with God. What you're doing is saying, I give up and I give in to that kind of love. If it's real, I give up and give in to that kind of love. And you should do that in your way. And God will teach you through his word what that looks like. And he'll use you to teach other people what that looks like. Some of you have been believers for such a long time that you think, man, I did that long ago. Did you really? Did you surrender to that kind of love? Or did you surrender in something as a child, but now it's time to redo that? Now it's time to surrender at a deeper level to that kind of love. Because God does that. And he's working right now in this room. And hey, listen, if you surrender, and if you find yourself moved to do that, the next step for you is to get baptized. Why is that important? Well, it's where we join the tribe. Not a live tribe, but the Christian tribe. It's where we go public with what God is doing very privately right now. And you sign up, and then Justine will sit down and share with you what baptism means, and then I'll meet you out there in the fountain, and I'll stand on you. I mean, whatever it takes. That's how you show the world that you believe. That's why Easter matters. And it's why it should matter to you. I think you should surrender. I do. Only because I did, and I continue to. And it's changing my life. So God, capture this holy moment. Use the words our team is getting ready to share. Cover us with your Spirit's presence. And anyone who is making that decision, Lord, don't let them get away without settling that business. In your name we ask, amen.